The grandfather clock in the downstairs hall struck 3. The sound did not chime, it groaned, a heavy, iron rattle that vibrated through the floorboards of Blackwood Manor and into the soles of Arthur's bare feet. 3 in the morning. The dead of night. Arthur sat at his desk, the weak ring of light from a single kerosene lamp keeping the vast, devouring shadows of the study at bay. He was a man of logic, a ledger-keeper by trade, accustomed to columns of numbers that balanced perfectly and truths that could be proven with ink and paper. But logic had fled this house weeks ago, leaving behind a cold, clinging dread that tasted like pennies and copper. Arthur, there is a space between the hours here. When the world goes quiet, the house begins to breathe. Do not listen to the rhythm of it. If you match your breaths to the walls, you give it permission to enter. He had dismissed it then as the fevered delusions of a dying woman consumed by consumption. Now, surrounded by the oppressive silence of her inherited estate, he wasn't so sure. The air in the room suddenly turned frigid. Arthur's breath plumed in white, ghostly clouds before him. The flame of the kerosene lamp flickered, stretching high and thin, casting long, skeletal shadows across the bookshelves, before snapping out entirely. Pitch black. Arthur froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The darkness of Blackwood Manor was not an absence of light, it was a physical weight, thick and suffocating. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers sweeping across the mahogany desk, searching for the matchbox. Scratch. Scratch. He stopped. The sound hadn't come from his fingers. It had come from the far corner of the room, near the heavy velvet drapes. Scratch. Scratch. Scrape. It sounded like fingernails dragging across wallpaper. Long, dry nails. Who's there? Arthur's voice was a pathetic wheeze. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air from his lungs. Then, from the darkness, came a sound that made his stomach drop. Inhale. Exhale. It was a breath. But it didn't come from a human chest. It was too vast, a wet, rattling respiration that seemed to emanate from the very woodwork of the room. It was the house. It was breathing. Panic seized him. Arthur lunged forward, his hand finally knocking against the small cardboard box of matches. He grabbed it, fumbling in the dark, and struck a match against the side. The sparks flew, blinding him for a fraction of a second, before a tiny, fragile amber flame bloomed. The room was empty. The drapes hung still. Arthur let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He quickly relit the lamp, the comforting yellow glow pushing the shadows back into their corners. "Get a hold of yourself," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "It's the wind. An old house settling. Nothing more." But as he leaned back in his chair, he noticed something on the desk. Right in the center of his sister's letter, a small puddle of dark, viscous liquid was forming. He looked up at the ceiling. Directly above him, a deep, reddish-black stain was spreading across the white plaster. It looked like blood, but it was too dark, almost like old oil. As he watched, another drop detached itself and fell, landing with a soft splat on the paper, obscuring Eleanor's final words. He needed to leave. Not just the room, but the manor. He would pack a single bag and walk to the village tavern, even if it meant navigating the fog-choked moors in the dead of night. Anything was better than this. Arthur grabbed the kerosene lamp, holding it high as he stepped out into the grand hallway. The corridor stretched out before him, a long tunnel of doors and portraits. The eyes of his ancestors seemed to track him through the gloom, their painted expressions twisted into grimaces of mockery and warnings. The air grew progressively colder as he walked toward the grand staircase. Every step he took echoed loudly, the floorboards groaning in protest. But as he reached the landing, he realized the echoes weren't matching his stride. He stopped. A second later, a soft, bare footstep sounded behind him. Thud. Arthur didn't turn around. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to keep his eyes forward. He took another step. Thud. Behind him, another step followed. Thud. He began to descend the stairs, his pace quickening. The footsteps behind him mirrored his speed, growing faster, louder, heavier. The sound wasn't of one person walking, but something shifting, sliding down the steps, a clumsy, disjointed movement. Arthur broke into a run. He sprinted down the remaining stairs, the lamplight swinging wildly, throwing chaotic, monstrous shapes against the walls. He hit the marble floor of the entrance hall and bolted for the heavy oak front door. He grabbed the iron handle and threw his weight against it. It didn't budge. No, 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 he prayed, rattling the handle violently. The door was unlocked, yet it felt as though it had been welded into the frame. It was a part of the stone now. The disjointed clicking sound reached the bottom of the stairs. At the base of the staircase stood a figure. At first glance, it looked like a woman, draped in a tattered, mold-stained white dress. But the proportions were entirely wrong. The arms were too long, hanging down past the knees, the fingers ending in elongated, blackened tips. The neck was bent at a horrific, impossible 90-degree angle, resting flat against the left shoulder. And the face. The skin was translucent, stretched tightly over a sharp skull, showing a web of black veins beneath. Where the eyes should have been, there were only deep, hollow sockets filled with a swirling, liquid darkness. The entity opened its mouth. It didn't scream. Instead, it emitted the sound of a death rattle, the exact, horrific gasping sound Eleanor had made in her final hours. Arthur, a voice mimicked. It wasn't Eleanor's voice, it was a composite of dozens of voices, layered over one another, screeching and whispering simultaneously. Arthur stumbled backward against the locked door, his legs turning to water. The creature took a step forward. Its joints popped and cracked with the sound of breaking dry branches. It moved with a sickening, jerky motion, like a marionette operated by a cruel, trembling hand. "What do you want?" Arthur screamed, tears of absolute terror blurring his vision. The creature stopped. Its head snapped from the left shoulder to the right with a sickening crack. The hollow socket stared into his soul. "The lease is expired," the chorus of voices hissed. "The house must be fed." The entity lunged. It didn't run, it blurred across the marble floor with impossible speed. Arthur reacted on pure adrenaline. He hurled the kerosene lamp directly at the creature. The glass shattered against its chest, splashing burning fuel across its white dress and the floor. A wall of bright, roaring fire erupted between them. The creature shrieked, a sound that shattered the glass of the grandfather clock and the surrounding portraits. It thrashed in the flames, its long arms flailing, but the fire didn't seem to consume it, it only enraged it. Arthur didn't wait to see more. He turned and sprinted down the side corridor, fleeing deeper into the bowels of the house. The smoke was already rising, thick and black, filling the narrow hallways. He ran blindly, turning left and right through the maze of Blackwood Manor, until he found himself in the conservatory. It was a massive room made entirely of glass panes and iron ribbing, filled with dead, withered exotic plants that Eleanor had once tended. Outside, the moon was full, casting a stark, silvery light through the glass. The storm had passed, leaving the night still and silent. Arthur rushed to the outer glass doors, grabbing the brass handles. Locked. He looked around for something to smash the glass, his eyes landing on a heavy iron planter. He lifted it, his muscles straining, and hurled it against the glass door. The planter bounced off with a dull thud. The glass didn't even crack. Arthur stared at it in disbelief. He struck it again, manually, with his fists. The glass felt like solid steel. The house wasn't letting him out. It had sealed every exit, transforming itself into a beautiful, architectural cage. "Please," Arthur sobbed, collapsing against the impervious glass. He looked out into the courtyard. Safe, open air was just inches away, yet it might as well have been on the moon. Then, the temperature dropped again. His breath plumed. The silvery moonlight filtering through the conservatory ceiling began to dim. Arthur looked up. A thick, black liquid was pouring over the exterior of the glass roof. It wasn't rain. It was the same dark ooze from his study ceiling. It crawled across the glass panes like living vines, blotting out the stars, blotting out the moon, plunging the conservatory into pitch darkness. From the entrance of the conservatory, the burning smell of kerosene arrived, accompanied by the heavy, rhythmic thudding of disjointed limbs. Thud. Click. Thud. The creature had followed him. The fire had burned away pieces of its tattered dress, revealing a torso made of charred, rotted wood and blackened bone. It was a manifestation of the house itself, a physical extension of the malice embedded in the ancient foundation. Arthur backed away until his spine pressed against the unbreakable glass wall. He had nowhere left to run. He was cornered, a rat in a trap of his own hubris. The creature crawled into the room on all fours, its elongated limbs bent like those of a spider. It moved slowly now, savoring the feast of his terror. The air grew so cold that Arthur's skin began to sting, frost forming on the edges of his collar. "Join us, Arthur," the entity whispered, the voices now sounding remarkably like his deceased family members. He could hear his mother, his father, and clearest of all, Eleanor. "It is so quiet in the dark. No more ledgers. No more numbers. Only the breath." The entity reached out a long, blackened hand. The tips of its fingers touched Arthur's cheek. The touch was absolute zero. It burned with an icy fire that paralyzed his muscles. He couldn't scream. He couldn't move. He could only watch as the liquid darkness within the creature's hollow eye sockets began to leak out, pouring down its pale cheeks like tears. The creature leaned in close, its broken neck twisting so its face was level with his. It opened its mouth wide, wider than any human jaw could stretch, revealing a throat that descended into an endless, bottomless abyss. "Inhale," the house commanded. Arthur's lungs acted on their own. He took a deep, trembling breath, drawing in the freezing, stagnant air of the entity's maw. And as he did, his heart stopped its frantic beating. It slowed, settling into a deep, heavy rhythm that matched the distant, vibrating pulse of the manor's walls. The terror faded, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hall struck 4. The morning sun eventually rose over the moors, its golden light striking the glass windows of Blackwood Manor. Inside, the conservatory was bright and peaceful. The dead plants sat in their pots, undisturbed. The glass doors were unlocked, swaying gently in a light breeze. The house was empty. In the study upstairs, a ledger lay open on the desk. The ink was dry. The final entry, written in a neat, precise hand that didn't belong to Arthur, read: "Accounts balanced. Total inhabitants, 0. The house breathes easy." And from within the walls, deep beneath the floorboards where the light could never reach, a soft, collective sigh echoed through the empty rooms, waiting for the next midnight to fall.